Welcome to the Jason de Sousa Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
Arminé Nalbandian, welcome to the Jason de Sousa Show.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
Look, it's great to see you after a long time, and it takes a podcast for us to get together, eh? So it's good to see you. So you're doing some really cool stuff at the Centre for Social Impact. I've been wanting to get you on for a while to talk more about it. The whole not-for-profit sector, the whole social impact sector has been a topic of conversation for so long, then who better than an expert to come on and talk about it. So welcome. So I guess the first question is, how'd you get into it?
Yeah, so quite an unusual journey in some ways, and then in others, when you piece together the longer story, it sort of starts to make sense. I think I've always worked in for-purpose spaces, so obviously we worked together briefly in government.
We did.
I stayed on for eons. I was there to the very
Actually,
the
you
very
were there
end.
far longer than me.
I think I was at the end of my tenure Gladys's longest serving staff member. So I was there for nearly 7 years, which is a very long time, and you were there for quite some time.
I was there for the first term.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I left.
That's a solid innings. Yeah.
I have the record actually of being the first chief of staff to leave the Baird administration.
Oh wow! Okay, I love these
Which
little
people, and at that time people couldn't
superlatives,
believe it. People said, "My goodness, it's Mike Baird. Like he's going to be premier forever." And I thought, well, he is, and I think he's wonderful. But
great.
my time in politics has come to an end.
Wise man, unlike me, who I thought, oh well, it'll be this year, I'll go, but I just loved it.
The problem is it's addictive, isn't it?
It is addictive.
The thing about working in government and in those sorts of roles is just the amount of impact that you have at a senior level, and you were very senior, and what you're working on it's just so momentous and so ginormous that it's sort of hard to believe that that's how things actually work.
Yeah. Well, I think, people will often ask me, as I'm sure you've often gotten this question as well, which is like, do you miss it? What was it like? And I'd say, I don't miss sleeping with and showering with two phones. Definitely don't miss that. And in fact, it took a while, particularly post-COVID, post bushfires, post-floods, then post-COVID, for me not to get a chill up my spine every time my phone would buzz. It was sort of this real, the real intensity of the job, especially the more senior you get and the more pointy end you get in terms of the closeness to the leader. There is a real sense of responsibility, and there is something fantastically brilliant about that responsibility that I think makes you really, really grateful to be in the role. And of course, the flip side of that is, because of the relatively short-term nature of political leadership, which I think is, of course, a much talked about flaw and much kind of debated flaw, and we all think, oh well, let's be Singapore, and but I think we can have those debates later on. But I think the reality of when you're facing the pressures, the media pressures, the stakeholder pressures, the internal party pressures, the likelihood that you're going to make really good decisions just decreases by nature. So I think, when you get to work on long-term issues that you're not going to bear those fruits, but you're part of the journey, that's when you think, oh my gosh, there's nothing quite like this. And I have to say, talking about the Baird years, and then of course the Berejiklian years, when I first moved to Australia, which was in 2011, I'm embarrassed to say, I went down George Street, and it was the first time I was spending some significant time in Australia. I'd been before, and I thought, what in the world is this place? This is supposed to be a global city. I was embarrassed. I was like, I can't live here.
But that was 2011?
Well, that was 2011. And I thought, this city is not what I expected it to be. Yes, it's incredible, it's beautiful, but it feels very old, and everything about it felt like it was not where the future was headed. Fast forward.
Because it was back then.
That's what it was. Yeah. Fast forward to, the incredible investment in infrastructure through the O'Farrell, Baird, and Berejiklian years, and you say, I'm genuinely proud of that. That is incredibly, we were one tiny part of that, and there were some incredible political leaders who said, I'm not going to be here to bear that fruit. Somebody else will cut that ribbon, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yep. That is when you say, there's nothing quite like it.
Well, actually, I tell the story quite often of Gladys's focus on Sydney Metro, which is, the fruits of that are still coming through now. But the second harbour crossing wasn't on the table at first, and she just fought and fought and fought for it and fought for it and fought for it and just didn't give up until the treasurer, then Mike Baird, who later became a huge proponent as premier.
As these things do. Successes many fathers and mothers,
agreed to it. And thank God that he did, because I think now, it's interesting with Sydney Metro Northwest. When it opened, I think people liked that it was an automated system and that it was singled away in 4 minutes. But it was going out to Tullawong, and it went there from Chatswood, and it didn't really impact that much of the population, I think, right? What really set the population alight on Sydney Metro was the opening of it towards the CBD, and now it's all people talk about.
That's right.
And now it's, well, hang on, of course we need metros. Where is my metro? And I think when the Minns government started to look at whether they should continue, building metros, the public response was clear, right? And that's despite the cost and
that's right.
the pain and the difficulty in building these things. And I think a modern city, if Sydney is going to be a global city, and is already a global city, you just have to have this infrastructure. It's just part of it. And I think that was the challenge in 2011, is that the Farrell administration, which Gladys and Mike and Dom and all these others were part of, inherited a policy framework where the previous administration had felt that investing in infrastructure simply would lead to a bigger city. The bigger city would fail. And there's a couple of problems with that, right? The population is growing in Australia anyway.
That's right.
The federal government sets migration policy, and where do they choose to live? They choose to live in Sydney or Melbourne, right, or Brisbane. So, and now the whole concept around this is, well, actually, we want them to live here because that will actually lead to stronger economic productivity. And now we've actually got a global competition for capital. We don't just mean, human financial capital, we mean human capital. We want people to live in Sydney because we want them to locate their businesses in Sydney. And we're at Barangaroo, right? Back in 2011, this thing was on its knees. The whole development was under strain.
Oh yes, that was one of the first projects I got to work on as a treasurer's office staffer, and I thought, oh my gosh, what a mess, But it was,
I remember vividly, and I again tell this story quite often. When I joined the government, the Premier invited me to a meeting with the then Lindley CEO, Steve McCann, and Steve is a smart, an exceptional boss, and he was a very good CEO. But when he came into this meeting, he was under some severe stress, and he was sort of talking to the Premier, and he sort of was not as cool and collected as he normally was. And I remember thinking, wow, I just don't think I could ever work for a guy like that. And 4 years later, I was working for him, as it goes. But look, it was a fascinating time. I mean, I think that period of time was just, it was a purple patch for New South Wales because we had this whole infrastructure agenda that started with that state infrastructure strategy that people pushed and pulled and ran around and to try and get it going. But it highlighted all the main bits, the motorway extensions, the rail network extensions, the development of light rail, precinct development. You then had the sort of creation of the whole three cities concept, which is now starting to come through. People talk about these things now as if they were sort of a fait accompli, but there was a tremendous amount of pain that went into getting those things through. I remember those cabinet infrastructure meetings being quite emotive, even the debate, I remember the debate around Waterloo versus the University of Sydney.
Oh, I remember that. Oh, that was quite. And I remember the sort of the moment of anticipation, waiting. Who's going to get it? And I do think it's an interesting one, of course, because of the particular plans around social housing in Waterloo and where we sort of ended up there. I think a recognition also, particularly, I think in the Baird years, and I think as we moved through the Baird-Jekyllin years, we had so much by way of crisis that took over what we were focused on, and
COVID, right?
An incredible leader through that. But I think the heart side, which I find, I'm now in a space where we work in the kind of forgotten areas, and we are working with people who have been largely forgotten by the systems that we operate in. And I think I do think back to those days and think, actually, there was a lot of heart. I thought, like, for example, the first principles approach, whether or not it was a success, I think is a different story, unfortunately. But the first principles approach of the Social and Affordable Housing Fund at the time, you know, big vision, very interesting in terms of trying to mobilize private capital and, of course, private land assets held by the churches and others.
Yeah.
I think the vision was fantastic. The execution of that vision may not have been perfect in terms of what we had wanted to see, but I thought, you know, you're thinking in the direction, and you're thinking in the direction on behalf of the people that don't have
100%.
the advocates that. So I think there was a huge emphasis on infrastructure, but it was actually, I'm not a member of the Liberal Party. I'm not some sort of strong defender of the Liberal Party, particularly now, frankly. But I think ultimately, it's easy to say, well, actually, these governments care only about the big end of town and the hard end of town, and actually that wasn't what it was about, and it never was about that with Gladys in particular, who I know very closely.
I'm smiling on the commentary on politics, because I think one of the things I found in government was how rarely sort of political ideology really came into some of these decisions, right? I mean, I think of Gladys's leadership during COVID. In a way, I often think that she was the right leader for the times, because, you know, she's so patient and she's so stable, and she just, you know, she approached everything with, you know, deep kind of thought, which, you know, as a Premier's office staffer when she was a transport minister was inherently frustrating.
Yes,
but
she knows her brief. That's for sure. Yeah.
But she was, I think, she was the right leader for the time during COVID. And I look back on COVID, you know, to the point of the more disadvantaged parts of society. COVID was unbelievably difficult for people who didn't enjoy, you know, sort of being able to be at home and work from home and all that sort of stuff. Yes, you know, you had JobKeeper, fine. But it was an immensely difficult time. And I do look back now, particularly around, you know, questions around lockdown and questions around whether some of it's benefit of hindsight, obviously, but whether we need to look at things like that differently for the next pandemic.
Oh, without a doubt. Now, I think there were certainly failures, and I think, in my view, lockdown was one of them, and in fact, it was the thing that we've resisted more, and people forget that, just how much pressure there was from all of the other jurisdictions in Australia to do the lockdown and to do things that were, totally,
Victoria.
Totally,
I mean,
and it was sort of, it was, you know, unfortunately, the curfews. I think the curfews were just problematic. But you know, one thing that I do want to point out is, I think one of the lost lessons for me out of the pandemic was that, you know, we were able to address homelessness, for example, in a way that felt impossible. And when you have crisis. And when you have this time, and I think globally we're in, you know, the kind of the meta crisis, the poly crisis, we're in this era of crises. I think there are opportunities in these moments to think about really intractable problems and say, okay, well, we have the resources we have, let's mobilize and let's prioritize, because if we don't, the long-term benefit, the long-term impact is going to be huge, right? Normally we know that equation, we know, okay, if we don't fix this now, these people are going to end up in this situation, and then, you know, if you don't address the children out of home care, the likelihood that they're going to end up in the prison system, like, we know these stats, but because the long life,
we've known them for a long time.
We've known them for a long time. They haven't changed. They've gotten worse. But the difference is when you you crunch all of that together and say, if we don't get to the solution now, tomorrow the really pointy end will show its head. Okay, well, we need to deal with the problem now. You saw people were housed, and I think homelessness as a housing problem, which is talked about often, is something that, you know, of course it's multifactorial, but I think we're often ready to blame the really hard things that can't be worked on. Oh, mental health's really hard. Drug and alcohol is really hard. Well, housing.
They want to be homeless.
That's oh my gosh, the endless attitudes
It's a lifestyle choice.
That's right. Or actually, if you have really pro-homeless policies in your city, people are just going to migrate from Melbourne to Sydney to be homeless here. I'm like, that actually, the facts don't bear that out. So it's so I think those moments of how do you think critically as a society about what you need to who you need to take care of and when and how. I think we have lost some of those lessons that came out of the pandemic because of the fog of war that we were in. That I think it's worth thinking a little bit about.
Pandemic,
I think it's a collective amnesia on purpose, of course. Nobody wants to remember it, but it is something that I often reflect on given my current role.
Well, that's a good segue, actually. So we can talk a lot about how we can influence things in government, because definitely when you're in a senior role and you have a smart minister or a smart premier, and you're allowed to exercise their brief for them, you can achieve a lot.
That's right.
But neither of us are in government.
That's right.
So your passion for for-purpose stuff in this role, how are you executing it?
Yeah, the passion for purpose has always been there for me. It's sort of innate. And in fact, I will just, before I answer that question, I'll get to one point, which is when Gladys became Premier, I had been, a very, very hardworking Treasurer's Office staff, was there at all hours. I loved the job. She said, what portfolio do you want? Which policy portfolio are you interested in? Now, everybody would say transport and infrastructure. And I was like, social policy. And she's like, sure. No one wants social policy, right? It's like
really?
completely unpopular.
Here you go.
You can never have a win. You can't get a good news story up. No one's incentivized because it's the whole media cycle works against you. No one wants to celebrate the good things. They only want to celebrate the bad things. And I was like, no, because my heart's always been there. Could have picked health. Well, health was part of it. Health is social policy. But yes, I think
you had that too. Okay.
I did. But I think the point of all of that is to say there's something innate, and I've always been a person who's been interested in this space and have worked in and around the space for some time. So the role coming to CSI was interesting because I thought, well, the higher education system as a lever for change is one that I've always been compelled by. Now, I don't have a PhD, I have multiple master's degrees, but I'd never kind of gone down that path of being an academic. But I was really interested in the power of evidence and the power of education.
Allegedly in business, we're also interested in those things.
Allegedly in lots of sectors. But I think for me, the social impact story and what we're able to achieve at CSI, we have levers that are pretty straightforward. So research, very obvious lever of any university. Education, so that is, of course, award programs for undergraduates, for postgraduates. We have an MBA in social impact across our 4 universities at the CSIs.
Specifically in social impact?
Yeah, it's basically I think one of our universities is specifically in social impact, and then the others are an MBA X. So you do effectively a core of an MBA, and then you pick 4 units that are social impact units. So you have an MBA in social impact. It's sort of an MBA X. So it is, and it's a novel kind of concept in some sense, or it certainly was when we started it. In fact, 18 years ago when CSI began sort of the concept of social impact, or the social impact professional, a head of social impact at a corporate was sort of, it just wasn't a thing. So in part we've been able to build that. So we sit in business schools. That's quite unusual. I think you would assume we would sit not, in a sort of social sciences faculty, but we sit in business schools across our 4 universities. And we think about the kind of intersection of the various sectors that are involved in purpose, which includes, of course, charities, of course, philanthropy, of course, government, but also business, and how they all, what levers can we pull? And we run the gamut in terms of our research of pure social policy, right through to social innovation, impact investing, looking at, ESG metrics. So we're quite comprehensive in terms of the work that we do. And on the education side, there's the award programs, as I mentioned, we teach into undergraduate, but actually, and my team in particular, run a range of executive education programs. And to me, I think the power of your levers in this space, your levers are limited compared to any other sector that isn't government. Completely. Yeah. But for me, education has been a really interesting one. So for example, we have a fantastic, really world-class ranked course that is focusing on not-for-profit board directors and saying, yes, of course you have to know fiduciary and regulatory duty. There are lots of people who do that. Go to AICD, go to others and learn that. You should know that. But actually, if you're sitting on a not-for-profit board, your actual role is also there for the beneficiaries of the service that you're running. So if you're running an out-of-home care service and you're so focused on the dollars and cents or the regulation that you're not thinking about the person at the center of it, which is so often the case. In fact, if you look at the way that we structure our organizations, the impact is so incredibly stymied by those incentives, short-term government contracts.
They're acting in favor of the.
That's right. So we teach a lot about, what is, how do you think mission and system first? If you're really your ultimate goal is to do yourself out of a job, then how do you think about that? What contracts do you actually have to say no to if you're really thinking about the beneficiary? And it has been incredible. It has been such a moment, some of the stories I hear, some of the calls I get after people take that course, who come from very different backgrounds, often corporate backgrounds, sitting on a not-for-profit board for the first time or the 50th time, and they say, I cannot believe I have not, that has never clicked for me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I joined a not-for-profit board and I go straight into board director mode.
Yeah. And that's very common and understandable and common. So that's one, and I think as a lever, so we think about what are the levers for systems change, what are the levers for social impact, and how do we catalyze with our tools those changes through our levers. So if we think about board directors, they're a clear and untapped lever. There's another piece which is very much about, which we're working on now, which is philanthropy. How do you, a sector that I think arguably is relatively unaccountable
What was the term you used earlier? Philanthrocrats?
Philanthrocrats, yes.
I love it. Tell me what a philanthroprat is.
So if you think about a philanthrocrat, and it's not, much like the term bureaucrat, which is not very popular, both are somewhat unpopular in the sectors. Yes. Indeed, we do. But the philanthrocrat is perhaps somebody who works in an institutional philanthropic organization. So somebody who works at the Paul Ramsey Foundation, Mindro Foundation, or a corporate foundation, AMP Foundation, whoever it might be, that works on behalf of the money.
I'd never heard the term.
Yes, it's an insider term, I think, but and again, probably not a very popular one, but here we are. And then we are also working with wealth holders directly. We're working with trustees, with advisors to wealth holders, and just thinking about, how do you uplift this sector in a way that there's been a whole journey before we came in to do that, but we're thinking, if impact is your focus and you're ultimately there to get the most impact bang for your buck, how do we help support you across our programs, and particularly across a new program called the Giving Academy that we've launched, to make sure that you're not abusing your power, you understand your power, you understand what it means, so you're not doing harm. Do no harm's a serious thing in philanthropy, unfortunately, and many philanthropists recognize that, and some are on the journey of recognizing that. How do you ensure that you're thinking about your role and what you bring, and also the limitations of your role
but
and
sort
what
of
you
do
bring.
no harm intentionally, I think is the thing.
Well, it's always do no harm
problems,
intentionally.
Right?
Yeah, it's sort of this the unintentional harm. Unintentional harm is certainly very significant, but there's also intentional harm. So there's a lot to think about in these roles, and I think very much about who is servicing that need in a way that is really practical, very much built with and for philanthropy, which is how we built the course. And there actually aren't that many organizations in Australia doing that. So we thought, if there's a need, we will do it. And actually, the philanthropy came to us and said, we need this. We want to work with you. So it's been for me, those are really exciting levers, because you think, what can a university do? Well, it can do a lot more than just the traditional. And this is kind of where CSI plays. We're in a much more practical, pragmatic kind of world, and we use our levers that can be sometimes feel very ivory tower to work directly with those who are on the ground trying to have an impact.
Do you feel that as part of the sort of focus on the not-for-profit sector, we've had a problem with the financialization of impact outcomes? And I think back to the heady days of the social benefit bond, right? Which I loved as a concept. And I loved it as a concept because it was like, well, okay, maybe we really can attract capital to solving the out-of-home care problem, with the idea that, well, if we bridge that gap between out-of-home care and post-school education or employment or whatever, and we avoid long-term unemployment, then basically this is the cost saving of long-term unemployment, and therefore you get a return to your bond. Conceptually, that makes sense. In practice, it was complicated. Is there? I mean, I love the idea. In fact, the fact that we tried it, I think is great.
Yeah.
But it didn't work, I think, because of its complexity. Is there a risk
Or
that
it
we're
has
trying
worked,
to,
but
or
in
it has worked?
smaller ways than we had hoped for originally with
A
Envision.
much better way of describing it, right?
Yeah.
It has not worked the way we had hoped.
Yes.
I think initially,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So in terms of scalability,
That's right.
So what is the right pathway? One, to say, well, we need to think about these things in dollars and cents terms, or is impact actually more of a societal human focus?
I think, I think it is unfortunately a bit of both. So I think the reality is you need to be so careful that you don't put too many eggs in one solution basket. And I think, frankly, the early days of the bonds, where this is the panacea. We're gonna, we're gonna mobilize financial capital, and that's where all the incentives. But of course, then you don't think
Let's
about
get the investment
actually,
bankers out, right?
That's right.
Here we go.
That's right. And in fact, if I'm
and they
honest,
did turn out. They did turn out.
If I'm honest, the Social and Affordable Housing Fund had the same kind
Yeah,
of
it
perils.
did.
And I think
It did.
when you think about how when you try to create new systems and new innovations, but you're working within existing systems, and you're not deeply recognizing before you come up with the idea and the plan, what are the incentives of that existing system? So government, highly risk averse. The most risk averse body you could possibly find, right? Extremely risk averse. One thing goes wrong, and that's it. We know we've been on the other end of that. Sorry, goodbye program. Terrible, right? So I think you're trying to create something that needs to have a risk appetite, but you're saying it can have no risk appetite. So what happens? Well, the complexity increases to match the risk. So we're going to make this super complex. We're going to so many hoops that you have to jump through to prove that thing is working, so that so I think there's sometimes an underappreciation between sectors, which I know is sometimes the work that you do, right? To kind of think about, well, how do you translate almost the from one sector to another? Somebody needs to be the go-between to explain the settings, the language, to help people kind of operate across borders.
Entirely.
I think there is something about that, particularly in social policy, that has made it so difficult for these new innovations to come in and stay as anything but a small pilot, and to kind of systemize, because the system pulls you right back into what is status quo, because its rules, its modes of operation are just so strong. So I think until we deeply recognize and understand that and work together to kind of break that down and say, all right, either political leadership, we're going to have a different risk appetite on this issue, and I'm willing to wear it. I think, for example, Victor Dominello did that with on a different issue, but on digital driver's licenses. I remember that argument. And I was one of those people who was like, what? You're going to do what? So I think there is a political leadership element. There's a question of how you bring along your detractors on a journey to kind of say, if we're going to take more risk or we're going to change the dynamics of the system, who is going to lose and who's going to win out of that? Let's work with those who think they're going to lose, have a perception of loss, and try and work with them to kind of change those dynamics. And I think, to bring it back to your original question, I think the idea of bringing the power of one sector into another, so financializing sort of the way that we think about social impact, conceptually had validity to some extent, but hadn't thought through the unintended consequences of working within an existing system. So, but I think impact is a messy space. It is really hard to measure. And
it involves human
impact,
beings.
It does. That's it.
Infrastructure is a bit more simple.
That's it. It's multifactorial. It involves human beings. Situations change. You can't pick up this thing over here and just bring it over here, and it will work the exact same way because of the human element. So I think there's something about that as we progress and we learn and we go through these zeitgeist moments of this is how you measure impact or this is how you get impact, we are slowly evolving, and there's a whole group of academics, practitioners, particularly in and around CSI, that are focused on these problems and are at the cutting edge of thinking about them from a social innovation standpoint.
The interesting thing is that being in corporate for a long time and dealing with corporates, where everybody cares. Everybody wants to do something. I mean, I remember here at Lend-Lease, when I was at Lend-Lease for a long time, the opportunity to be involved in social affordable housing, all of the graduates, that was their number one thing. Like, I want to be involved in that. I want to be involved in that. Right now,
Gives me joy.
that's great, wonderful, except, businesses are for profit, right? And one of the big challenges, I think, between the expectations of public policy and the expectations of public policy over business is that business is happy to provide a service, but it has to do it in a financially profitable way.
That's right.
And so the question then becomes, governments, do you want that service provided or not? Now in infrastructure, it's kind of worked. In infrastructure, it's, well, okay, we can run this type of public-private partnership. I'm the government, you provide me with this asset, I will rent it from you for 25 years or so, and then I get it back. You take all the risk, you take all the construction risk, you take everything, and you provide me with a service. I don't have to be involved with it other than benefit from it. Fine, I'm willing to pay that cost. It's worked to some extent on toll roads. You can say, well, toll roads are, we want to charge, we want road user pricing, we want less cars on the road, we want a society to benefit from less cars on the road. If you can afford to drive a car and you're running a business or whatever else, you can pay for it. And that allows us to spend money on public transport. Right? That was the other angle around that.
Yes, yeah.
When it comes to social policy, though, things start to become complicated with that type of concept. And I think most recently with the Northern Beaches Hospital being an example of that, right? It was a pure private hospital that was delivering public services, and arguably there was a conflict in the way that kind of came out.
Yeah.
And so it seems that private finance works fine when you're just doing the building, but when you start involving people in a public service, that's when things become complicated.
And then you see, of course, the private providers of childcare and the incredibly devastating circumstances there. So, I've actually changed my view on this. So I was, having come from the US, was probably more open to private operators running social services. I have changed my view on that completely.
So why?
So I think the profit motive is valid and is how our society is run. Yeah. But when you are working in spaces that are very messy, very human, very much require you to have a different North Star, and your legislated, if you're a public company, mandated North Star is different, those two things, when they are at odds, and they will be at odds more often than I think we want to appreciate, the one that has to win is profit, because that's how these structures work. So I think, knowing that, I think it is a flawed premise to say, oh no, you can do both. And yeah, of course, there are always examples of people who have done both, but that is not the norm. And in fact, the risk that you're taking is too great. And I similarly think, privatized prison systems, I have problems with a lot of these concepts in ways that I hadn't thought through as critically before. And, the benefit, of course, of having lots of experiences in life and then working in politics is sometimes these, and I did have plenty, but not as many as, of course, we as we age. This is also another sad and perverse reality, is the older you are, the less likely you are to work in politics, because it is a brutal job.
It is a young person's game.
It is a young person's game, but of course,
regularly. Would you
please be the chief of staff? Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 That's very nice. But no,
it's very kind of you to ask.
Indeed.
Would you consider being an MP? Thank you. But I think if I was going to do that, I needed to be. There's a new opposition leader in Victoria as of yesterday.
Yes,
she's 35 years old, right? Mother of a young child.
Used to work at BCA, know her, yes.
There you go, right? And by all accounts, I don't know her, but by all accounts, she's very impressive, right? But she's 35 years old. Like that is kind of unheard of in a way. It's really only the last.
Zoran Mamdani, but yes,
But another case in point,
that is an incredible.
Dominic Perrottet, he became premier at what, 40? Might have just been 40.
Yeah.
Might not have been, right? He was, managed to have multiple children in a short period of time. But anyway, so.
Yeah. But politics, it's a young person's game. But if we don't have people who have, and this is to some extent the necessity of wisdom at a young age, is you absolutely need that in order to, I think, function well in politics, and not to turn into, not to listen to your better angels, to know what those better angels are. It takes time to learn that. But I think if you don't have a mix of generations in a political system at a leadership level, you're not always going to, you will be blind to some of what's coming around the corner. I don't mean that as an ageist comment. I just think that is, in general, being at a different life stages. I'm a parent now. I have a different lens. I just didn't have this
100%.
lens in detail before being a parent. I understood it conceptually. Of course, I have nephews. I have family. It's not the same. It's not quite the same thing. So I think there are experiences and diversity of experiences that political life needs. And I think, in fact, our current Liberal Party is suffering greatly from that lack of diversity of viewpoints, of certainly of gender, I think there's a lot in that we need to be thinking about structurally. And I think it's often discussed and sort of now almost pointless to talk about it because of how much we talk about it, but we still don't act on it. We still don't think about that. So I think generational diversity is also another aspect of diversity.
I agree. That's actually a good segue. So the Mandamni thing kind of reminded me a little bit. So one of the things I've been wondering about is sort of whether capitalism or our system of economic development is actually failing young people. And the reason why I asked that is, I was thinking about it the other day, that we talk about housing, right? 1950, what was it, 3 times your income you could buy a house. Now it's something like 12 or 13. You've got, still student debt has become an issue in Australia. It was never really before. University education was free within the lifetimes of people who are still working today. It's not anymore. There is a pressure point on the types of jobs that are available. Like wages are good, fine, but they're not growing like they used to. Sort of a white collar corporate job is not paying as much as it used to, and so you look at all of those things, and you look at the election of Izora Nalbandian, for example, who's promising things that seem a bit odd. Subsidised grocery stores, for example. Okay, that's an interesting one. Free bus services. Well, you should have talked to Premier Palaszczuk because she did that anyway. But these are exceptionally popular policies, and you look at why are young people doing this? Well, they're working several jobs, at least in the United States case, and so probably the same here. They don't see a prospect to having a pool of savings. There are stats out there about the fact that if you had an emergency, you might not have enough in your bank account to sort that out. I can't remember. I wish I could remember the actual stat, but we've heard it several times before. People have only a few $1,000s, right, and they have an impact. Given your perspective, I'm curious. Is the economy failing young people?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm loath to give black and white answers because I think it depends on.
I don't think there is
whom
a
you ask,
answer,
right?
Yeah.
There are certainly those in our society of a very young generation who are reaping the benefits of youth through their adoption of technology in ways that are perhaps less accessible to people of different generations. There's a nativity to learning from day one how to use technology versus at our generation learning it much later comparatively, and then of course not even to speak to generations past us. So I think there is a uneven distribution of who benefits, but I think there's also a question of intergenerational equity, which is what I'm hearing you talk about, which is this sort of idea really that your children en masse will be better off than you were, and that dream really
that used to be the case, didn't it?
That's right.
That used to be the case.
Right. And I think affordability and general cost of living pressures are certainly changing that picture and changing the experience. I think a lot about the fact that I moved out of my house when I was 18, and I learned, a lot from doing that at a young age. I was, your prefrontal cortex is not developed. You're still a child. And yet,
probably more responsible than I was.
Well, was I? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I think the benefit of doing that and having those rites of passage within a set of circumstances, privileged circumstances, of course, but still, you don't have, my corollaries at 18 are not moving out of their houses.
No,
They're not
even
living
close.
in independence. And there's all those other ways in which we're sort of changing these generations and kind of underappreciating what that means.
I would say 18 is actually considered a lot younger now than it was when we were 18.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And
actually.
I think our 18 was younger than previous generation's 18. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
you wouldn't look at an 18-year-old now and think, right, off you go, off to work. You can still go to war and whatever else, but off you go.
Yeah.
And I bumped into some 18-year-old girls the other day who were friends of my business partner's daughter, and I'm like, wow, that's what 18 looks like now. Right?
Yeah.
It looks very young. It could be that I'm advancing at age.
Yeah, I was going to say, and we have to be, there's some danger here in this conversation that we're just being, that generation. But indeed.
In my day.
I know, well, but truly, right. But I do think the question of, is the economy structured in a way that is, ensuring that the generations that keep coming are better off. I think we are seeing some real problems, some real headwinds, and we are actually, I think, because of the fact that we don't know what AI will do to the workforce and to the next generation. We don't really, we understand it, there's forecasting. We got that wrong. It's actually the white collar workers that are going to be impacted, not that, we're still figuring a lot of that out, and the advances day by day affect that thinking. So we're in a really rapidly moving environment. And to me, I think as much as it is such, again, an obvious thing to say, but we don't have the political leadership at the moment, not in this country, to kind of deal, and this is definitely not a criticism of the Labour Party, it's more of a criticism, frankly, of the opposition at the moment, which is, pains me to say so, but it's embarrassing in my view that we are so populist and unwilling to look beyond our own internal incentives and look beyond that, in my view, to say, what does intergenerational equity look like? What do people really want for their families and their individual lives? And how do we ensure that we can set the economy up for success in light of these headwinds? Not, we'll kind of light touch do some regulation and try and understand the risks, but what does that look like? So I do feel like the sentiment around not feeling positive about the future is very problematic, and I have a lot of hope in the younger generation, but I do think, broadly speaking, there's a validity to saying the current economic structure is challenging. Do we have a different option? I don't think there are. There are lots of people who talk about universal basic income, which I'm not a strong proponent of, but I understand, look, to some extent, resource-rich countries have had UBIs for some time.
Well, effectively, we have one.
Yeah, right? True.
If we think about it.
There's, and there are sort of corollaries to it, but I think there's something about the idea of how we restructure and how we take leadership in those conversations and with whom we do. And I think for me, at the forefront should be human dignity and how we preserve human dignity and how we allow people to live better lives than what they have today. I think there's something about that requires populism to be kind of set aside and long-term thinking to be prioritized, and that is political leadership to me.
It depends on what populism is as well, I think, right? I mean, one of the things that worries me a little bit is in order for us to be a successful society, we have to be positive about it, right? We have to believe in it. We have to want it to be better.
Yeah.
And this is just my view, I look at the amount of pressure upon society to divide into different things. We'll divide by race, we'll divide by sex, we'll divide by the gender, we'll divide by employment, and it becomes harder. And then, of course, you have I'm going to call it a social media class, because I don't know whether the media really matters that much anymore. It's a social media class that just plays you back the things you want to hear all the time.
The algorithms,
right? And so you just this sort of feedback loop, and that just divides further, and then you start to get these sort of bizarre extremes that come to pass, and then you start to get these sort of very ugly incidents, like the rise of the neo-Nazi in Australia, which I think is the strangest thing.
Sort of unimaginable 5 years ago,
unimaginable. And I just, you start to get this, and you're like, wow, right? And so I just wonder.
Although, I say unimaginable, but then you think the White Australia policy wasn't that long ago, and you think like there are elements of that, obviously not quite the same thing, but there are elements of that have perhaps been there and have been rightly tamped down, I think, or
Yeah.
kind of we thought we moved beyond, but maybe we haven't. And the contagion effect, I think, from what happens because of these algorithms.
Yeah, correct.
So whatever's
Yeah.
happening in the US or these other areas that are deepening their divides for structural reasons as well, remembering our political system, I think, is one of the best in the sense that we have the moderating force of, mandated voting, we have the moderating force of preferential voting, we have a lot of, we have the Electoral Commission, we have a lot of bodies that kind of are protective, and I think many, certainly in the UK and in the US, look at these systems and say, oh wow, if only. And I do think they have been beneficial to Australia, but they cannot protect you from the contagion that the algorithms
Well, that's what I mean. The strength of society, again, depends a bit on political leadership as well, right? Because we need to be able, and I think Chris Minns is doing that, by the way.
Yeah.
I think the way he's come out on these matters has been fantastic.
I agree, yeah.
And he has displayed societal leadership that I wish other politicians did.
I totally agree,
And look, I mean, that's an interesting point actually around society. So we had sort of the last 20 years or so this focus on, ESG, and you started seeing that come into reports, and there was a triple bottom line. And is ESG dead?
It's interesting to see. We moved from sort of CSR to this increasing conversation about ESG, and there's sort of this sort of sense of we have a responsibility here because our stakeholders and shareholders, and to your earlier point, the younger generation of our staff and the people coming in care about these issues in a way that we perhaps would not have seen as core business. And of course, the larger conversation about long-term risk and how you are, particularly at a board level, guarding against that and thinking about that through an ESG lens. Particularly governance, particularly E. S is the hard one. So
S
I
is
think
the one that
when I
always
look
gets
at,
forgotten,
well, it's the hardest in some ways because it's right now it means something other than a very few pieces of legislation. So the sort of human slavery and those sorts of obligations exist, but and even those, you can argue the regulatory frame isn't where it needs to be. I think there's a question about what do we really care about as a society, and how do we, the likelihood that the incentive is to greenwash, whitewash, social wash, do anything that is wash. Yeah, no, that's not it. That is
it's not a thing.
That's not a term. Whitewashing is a thing, but not in this.
But not in this context.
Not in this context. Washing in general, I think the incentive is.
Let's go back to a property development podcast for whitewashing.
Whitewashing, yes, that's
some
right.
Interior design tips. Right.
That's right. I think there is a incentive that is again profit driven, and I think I can't quote the exact rating or which ranking this was on, but when I first came to CSI, so this would have been about 4 years ago, I was looking at some ESG ranking that had just come out, and Star Casino was like number 2, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Right? Like this is then you're like, okay, ESG is dead, because if there's any world in which Star Casino can ever be on an ESG ranking and be high, I think then we haven't thought critically about what ESG is meant to, what we all actually mean by it. So I think, I look at those and it's hard for me not to be incredibly cynical. There are organizations that I think are increasingly taking, and some of these are the big tech, Canva, you look at how they're treating, as the founders, how they're treating their wealth and how they're thinking about what that means in terms of the responsibility of their staff. So there's certainly are green shoots. There's certainly exemplars in our various industries of organizations that take those roles seriously. But I think, again, when you rub up against the profit motive and you don't have regulation, you just have the brass tacks of what ends up being real. So if you don't have stakeholder pressure, so the US is a great example, many companies turning away from their ESG commitments because of what's happening in Trumpistan. I think there's so much there that you think, of course this is what was happening. And in fact, we were seeing it happen even in Australia with, I need to find that ranking because I feel like I talk about it too much and maybe it's a figment of my imagination. I'm kidding, it isn't. But that Star Casino example is unfortunately valid, and I think that's what makes me say, is ESG real? And I think if you're not really prioritizing it because of shareholders or stakeholders, and your boards aren't really thinking about the long-term risk of not prioritizing it, and understanding that deeply, it starts to me to feel like you're very quickly falling into the territory of it's not real.
Here's an interesting view from where I sit on it, which is I look at government and I say, I come from a perspective that says less government is better, right? Generally. Bigger government, as much as everybody likes government solving every problem, it can't solve every problem. It's better to let human ingenuity be as free as possible to solve its own problems, and you should try and, perhaps not as excessive as Milton Friedman, but try and reduce government to the point where the society has a chance to solve its problems. But the number one job of government is to set what the rules of the game are, and to make those rules as limited as possible without damaging the public good. I see that as ESG. I think that is the whole purpose of ESG, is to say, well, how do I make sure that the for-profit motive is there? Everyone gets to make money, everyone does a job, they provide a service, consumers buy that service. Isn't that really wonderful? Everyone gets paid. But you can't do it by polluting the waterways. You can't do it by massive unsafety on construction sites. You can't do it by, I always think of what's a monumental example of failure in this place is the Pakistani, Bangladeshi shipbreaking yards. You ever seen those videos? Where you have these sort of, poverty-stricken rural people coming in and breaking in sandals, and, they might have a tokenistic piece of safety equipment while they're breaking away. Like Bangladesh gets something like 40% of its steel from that industry. It's just extraordinary, right? That is what failure looks like, I would suggest, right? So when we talk about ESG in our context, it's like, well, maybe I get the need for boards and the corporate sector and all that to provide its own guidance. I think that's right. But I think it's also that guidance stems from political leadership again. Right? So all really comes back to that point. And and I think it's becoming increasingly hard to be a political leader, to be honest.
Oh, absolutely. And and as I feel I can be critical of it because I have seen how hard it is. Sorry, I'm not probably not supposed to swear on this podcast.
No, you
but
can.
It is
actually, I think we should
challenging.
introduce that sort of language.
The swearing rule, love that. But I think that's it. That I have a deep appreciation
I just came from a meeting with the construction business here, and believe me, the language is fantastic.
I was going to say you're used to it. Then that's no. One of my favorite words. That word.
I use that one a lot too. My kids pick me up on it.
Well, Dad, this is the challenge. Now I have a little 2-year-old, and he will repeat that word if I say it. So I'm not allowed to.
It gets to a point that the world famous Taylor Swift, who I've banned in the car, has swear words in her songs, and you can actually put on the clean version, which their mother does, but I don't do it. And Dad, we can't play the song because the clean version's not.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, I love them.
And we would digress.
I love them. That's really good. But I think the political leadership point is unfortunately what we come back to, and I think the reason it's unfortunate is because we both know how hard it is, and I think I point to that earlier example of I do think the decisions around transport, which were not easy, and infrastructure were moments of very clear political leadership because they were not always popular. I mean, even if you look at the light rail and what Gladys went through for the light rail and the public bashing she got for a very long time, and now people are like, oh, it's so beautiful, it's wonderful. Oh, yeah, it's slow, but and I think that's the thing that is leadership to me, and we can show that at federal levels, we can show it in every aspect of what we do, but we also need to find ways to I think help our political leaders in the sectors that we work in to have that courage to be able to put that forward, put those ideas forward. And so I often, when there are rightfully many people in the social sector who want to criticize government, and I say, well, yes, that is a tool, and you can press the red button and go really hardcore and have a coalition of people who argue against to get something done. And actually, sometimes that is very valid and necessary. But actually think about how you can work genuinely productively to use your power to help politicians make hard decisions. So that's what I think is incredibly underdone because we don't have the muscle for it.
So one of the things I would argue is that I think it's very easy to say, I don't like this. This is wrong. This is bad. This is wrong. But, and I see so many social services organizations, industry bodies, whoever, who do that. I think policymakers respond best when you say, okay, it's wrong, but and here is an alternative. And we were talking earlier, Noel Pearson's come out with a new concept around how to help the bottom 1 million Australians escape poverty. And you remember Cape York Institute was very focused on Indigenous Australians. He's now said, well, actually, this policy framework should be wider, and it should focus on education. It should focus on personal responsibility. And I'm curious to see what the details actually are. But the emphasis is right, which is let's actually work together to try and solve some problems. Here is an idea. Let's now, in society, debate that and talk about it. And going back to your earlier point, in government, these days it's so difficult to raise anything up a flagpole. You raise an idea at a flagpole, you immediately get accused that it's going to aim in Waterford, and I talked about this. You immediately go, bang, it's gone by the afternoon.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just not a pathway to success.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't believe it's been an hour already.
I can't
It's
either.
extraordinary.
Fantastic.
But I like to ask people when they go on the show, like, if there were 3 things, and this is particularly relevant for you, I think, if there were 3 things that you'd like to see happen in your space, what would they be?
So many more than 3. It's so hard.
I'm restricting
this is
you.
a great
I'm
question.
restricting
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we didn't talk about, which I think goes to the long-term nature and kind of the incentives question, one of the things that I've realized quite clearly coming out of politics and coming out of government is that the way in which we fund our social services and our not-for-profits and those who are caring for the most, for people and planet on behalf of our sectors, is to give them short-term contracts and to keep them on a starvation cycle where we don't pay. In any other circumstance, you'd say, okay, we'll take care of your staff, make sure you have good cybersecurity infrastructure, make sure you have this, make sure you have that, make sure you're running a functional organization. And in the not-for-profit sector, we say, we want you to minimize all those costs to the point of almost zero.
Shoestring.
And that's what good looks like. And we want you to put all the services out to the people. And I'm like, well, if you're, I have now been in a not-for-profit CEO role, and I know how much of my time is spent on the hustle of asking for money. And I'm like, do you know how much waste in my own, like, if you could not just quantify the waste of that time, but quantify the waste of that impact that I could be having and thinking about different problem, solutions, which is what I'm actually here to do.
Yeah.
I think that we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. So I think a serious conversation with government about how they think about back office, admin, whatever you want to call it, costs as part of government contracts is very practical and hard to.
Rationalizing the way how not-for-profits can work more together as well on back office stuff.
Yeah,
right?
and I think there are examples of that. I was actually just speaking to somebody today about how Singapore has an interesting setup about helping not-for-profits think about and actually sort of consolidate back office functions. Now, it's sometimes easier said than done, but there are models we can look at, and I think there are productivity gains if you look at it through that lens. But I think it should just never be that we're in a scarcity mindset and everybody's going to operate on a starvation cycle, and that's how we're going to get the impact. Because actually, poverty is getting worse, not better. Like the fact that 1 in 6 kids in this country live below the poverty line.
It's mind-blowing.
It's
we didn't actually talk about that element.
Anyway,
yes,
so sorry. So that's one.
Yes.
2 is very much on theme with what we've been talking about, which is political leadership and thinking really deeply about the dignity of human beings and the primacy of that in public policy, I think is incredibly important. And, I think 3 would be the people that wield the greatest power, and we are 2 people who wield power, I think thinking about their responsibility in a societal sense as something that is not a nice to have, but is something that you have to spend internal time educating yourself on how to be a good board member, how to be a good executive, how to think with purpose in everything that you do. I think there's something about that call out that I think if each of us do our part to think very critically about our own roles and how we operate in the world, at a leadership level, we will all be better off.
Well, I'm certainly going to behave better at my next not-for-profit board meeting. Arminé Nalbandian.
Impact first.
Impact first. Arminé Nalbandian, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Jason. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for having me.
A lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.